In 1868, a trail boss wrote in his personal diary that his crew smelled worse than the 2,000 head of longhorn cattle they were pushing north. He did not write that as a complaint. He wrote it as a plain observation, the same way a man might note the weather or the price of beef. That one sentence tells you almost everything you need to know about daily life on the open range. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Clay, and this is your channel for the real history of the American West. Not the cleaned-up version Hollywood has been selling for over 100 years. Today, we are going somewhere most history books skip entirely. We are talking about cowboy hygiene, and I will warn you right now, it is not pretty. If you are new here, go ahead and subscribe. Leave a comment when something surprises you. There will be plenty of moments for that. Let us get into it. The first thing you have to understand about a working cowboy is what he owned. Not what he might have owned in some idealized version of the West, but what the average trail hand actually carried on a cattle drive in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. A wool shirt, canvas or heavy wool trousers, a hat, a pair of boots that were already broken in before he bought them, a bandana, and maybe, if he was lucky, a spare pair of socks rolled up somewhere in his bedroll. That was it. That was the entire wardrobe. And on a drive that could last anywhere from 8 to 14 weeks, he would wear all of it, every single day. Not most days, every single day. From the moment the herd left Texas to the moment it arrived in Abilene or Dodge City or wherever the railroad was waiting. Wool was the fabric of choice, not because it was comfortable, and out on the southern trail routes in summer it absolutely was not, but because it held warmth when wet and survived the punishment of hard daily work far better than cotton or linen. In the heat of the Texas plains, where temperatures regularly pushed past 35 degrees in the summer months, a man wearing heavy wool trousers and a thick flannel shirt was essentially walking around in a personal oven all day. Every day. For months. The sweat soaked into the fabric and dried. Then it happened again the next morning. And the morning after that. The salt from the skin formed a stiff crust in the fibers. Trail dust worked its way into that crust. Tambat. Grease from the food and from handling the animals embedded itself into the weave. After a few weeks, the clothing was no longer simply dirty in the way a work shirt gets dirty after a long day in the yard. It had been transformed into something more like a second skin, a compressed record of every mile ridden and every hour worked, made of dried sweat, dust, and everything else the trail had to offer. The skin underneath fared no better. Water on a cattle drive was a managed resource, and the order of priority was clear. The herd came first, because the herd was the entire point of the operation. The horses came second, because without the horses there was no drive. Cooking and drinking came third. Personal hygiene came last, which in practice meant it almost never happened at all. Some cowboys completed an entire drive without washing more than their hands and face, and even that was done with whatever water was available, which often meant a river that had already been used by the herd upstream. And then there were the lice. Body lice were not an occasional inconvenience on the frontier. They were a permanent, universal feature of trail life. The cowboys had a name for them. Seam squirrels. The name came from the fact that the insects lived in the seams of clothing, where overlapping layers of fabric created warm, dark channels, ideal for nesting and laying eggs. They fed on blood. They reproduced constantly, and they caused an itch that did not stop. Day or night, sleeping or riding, there was no relief. The standard remedy was to boil the clothing in a large pot over the campfire, which killed the insects and the eggs effectively. The problem was obvious. A man whose only set of clothes was sitting in a boiling pot had nothing to wear while he waited. So he sat by the fire, in the open air, and waited. The cook tried to look busy elsewhere. There was a more practical alternative that required no fire and no pot. Spreading infested clothing flat over an active anthill and leaving it there for a few hours worked surprisingly well. The ants would swarm the fabric and consume the lice and the eggs systematically, drawn by the organic material in the fibers. Cowboys figured this out through observation and necessity, which is exactly the kind of practical ingenuity the frontier demanded. The saddle itself introduced its own category of suffering. 10 to 12 hours a day in the saddle, day after day. with no protective barrier between the skin and the leather, produced open sores on the inner thighs and the seat. The heat and the sweat made it worse. There was no rest from it during an active drive. You rode through it, treated it as best you could with whatever was available, and kept moving, because the cattle were not going to wait. And what do you think? Could you have handled 3 months of that without a single change of clothes? Drop your answer in the comments below. The state of a cowboy's mouth was something a modern dentist would look at with genuine distress. Toothbrushes existed in the 1800s. They were standard items in settled households. But they were not things working trail hands carried in their bedrolls at dawn, and there was no infrastructure on the open range to support anything like a dental hygiene routine. Most cowboys who cleaned their teeth at all did it by rubbing them with a rough cloth or a finger dipped in salt or wood ash. This removed surface staining and not much else. The bacteria responsible for decay continued their work uninterrupted. Chewing tobacco was nearly universal among working cowboys. It was cheap, it was portable, and it was one of the few available comforts on a long drive. The constant contact between tobacco and the gum line accelerated deterioration significantly. The tannin stained the teeth dark. The acidity damaged the enamel. The nicotine restricted blood flow to the gums and weakened the tissue over time. Scan. Period photographs and first-hand accounts consistently describe men in their 30s and 40s with mouths that looked considerably older. Blackened and worn teeth, swollen gums, missing teeth in the front where the damage had progressed the farthest. When a tooth became too painful to function with, and on the frontier that was the threshold at which action was taken, there was rarely a qualified dentist within practical reach. In the larger trail terminus towns, a barber sometimes doubled as a dental practitioner with basic tools and some experience. But out on the range, or in the smaller supply towns along the route, you found whoever had steady hands and a workable tool. Sometimes that was the camp cook. Sometimes it was the blacksmith. The procedure was exactly what it sounds like. The tooth was gripped with pliers or whatever could serve the same function, and it was pulled. There was no anesthetic. Whiskey was the standard preparation, consumed in whatever quantity the patient could manage beforehand, but alcohol is a genuinely poor substitute for pain management, and the procedure was not one men forgot quickly. Infections following these extractions were common, and in the complete absence of anything to treat them effectively, they could develop into serious systemic problems. Shaving carried its own risks. Most cowboys carried a single multi-purpose knife that handled every cutting task required of them. Skinning game, cutting rope, preparing food, trimming leather. That same knife went to the face when a shave was needed. Properly honing a blade for shaving is a specific skill, and a hunting or camp knife is not designed for it. Nicks and cuts were common results. A cut on the face, made with a blade that had been used for everything else, was an open invitation for infection. Blood poisoning from shaving wounds is documented in frontier medical records as a cause of death, which is a fact that takes a moment to land properly. The available medical resources for treating any of these conditions were limited and not always safe in themselves. Frontier doctors, where they existed at all, were working with a restricted kit and knowledge that was, by modern standards, partially correct at best. For open wounds and infections, what was available was what was used. Gunpowder and tobacco were packed into wounds as crude antiseptics, creating conditions hostile to bacterial growth. The logic had some basis. The experience of having either substance pressed into a fresh wound was, by every account, extremely unpleasant. Scurvy appeared on the longer drives with some regularity. The trail diet provided almost no vitamin C, and after 10 or more weeks of salted beef, dried beans, hardtack, and coffee, the effects began to show. Gums swelled and bled at minimal pressure. Joints became stiff and painful. Old healed injuries had a tendency to reopen as the connective tissue broke down without adequate nutrition to maintain it. Most cowboys experiencing these symptoms did not know the cause. They knew they felt wrong, and that riding hurt more than usual. A thoughtful trail cook who carried dried fruit or vinegar could prevent most of this, and the ones who did had noticeably healthier crews at the end of the drive. The ones who did not found out the hard way. The question of sanitation on an active cattle drive requires some imagination to fully appreciate, because there was no infrastructure for it whatsoever. There were no facilities. There were no designated areas. When a man needed to attend to personal business, he found a spot away from camp that offered reasonable separation from the group, and he used it. Privacy was a relative concept when dozens of men were living and working together in open country with nothing taller than scrub brush in any direction. You went when you needed to go, and everyone else politely looked elsewhere. What served as toilet paper on the frontier was whatever was at hand. Dried corn cobs were a documented and regularly carried option, practical enough that men specifically brought them for this purpose. Grass was used when nothing else was available, with the risk that came from selecting in haste or in low light. Period accounts describe encounters with poison ivy in this context that removed a man from active riding for several days. It was the kind of mistake made once. Water was the central problem that ran through every aspect of trail sanitation. The rivers and streams along the major cattle routes were shared resources used by every herd, every outfit, and every creature moving through the same corridor. The herd upstream fouled the water downstream. Other drives running parallel routes contributed to the same waterways. The water that cowboys drank and cooked with and occasionally splashed on their faces was frequently silty, warm, and biologically compromised in ways they had no means of testing and no real awareness of. Water canteens of the period were made from leather, animal bladder, or sealed wood. Leather and bladder canteens flavored the water they held, particularly after the vessel had been sitting in direct afternoon sun for several hours. This was simply accepted as the taste of water on the trail. There was no alternative on offer. The trail diet compounded every physical problem the men already had. The standard provisions for a cattle drive were designed for caloric density, preservation, and minimal weight on the chuck wagon. Nutrition in any modern sense was not a consideration. Salted pork, dried beans, hardtack biscuits, and coffee formed the foundation of every meal, every day, for the duration of the drive. A skilled trail cook could do impressive things within those constraints and was genuinely valued by any experienced trail boss. But the constraints were severe, and the nutritional gaps were real. The digestive consequences were well documented. Constipation was common during the early weeks of the drive. Dysentery, caused by bacterial contamination from the water or the food, was one of the leading causes of death among working cowboys during the cattle drive era. Contemporary records from the trail towns, from army surgeons passing through, and from newspaper accounts of the period consistently show that intestinal illness killed more men in the West than violence did. It was not a quick or dramatic death. It was a slow and physically exhausting one, and it claimed men who had survived everything else the trail could throw at them. Flies were everywhere. They followed the herd because the herd produced what flies need. They followed the food because food was available. They were drawn to any wound or sore on men or animals. Keeping food protected from contamination in open-air trail cooking was essentially a constant losing battle. The cook did his best. The men ate quickly and without looking too closely at what was in the pan. The campfire served a function beyond cooking and warmth. Standing in the smoke deliberately, letting it move over the skin and through the clothing, killed a portion of the bacterial load and drove insects away. Cowboys did this regularly, and observers who visited working drives noted it specifically. It is one of the reasons the smell of wood smoke became so permanently attached to the image of the working frontier cowboy. They were using it as a substitute for soap, because soap was something they did not have. When a cattle drive finally reached its destination after months on the trail, the cowboys were paid and turned loose on the town. They had been riding since spring. Most of them had not had a proper bath, a real meal, or a change of clothes in anywhere from 10 to 14 weeks. They had money in their pockets for the first time in months, and the businesses of the trail terminus towns were organized to take as much of it as possible, as quickly as possible. The bathhouses of the frontier cattle towns ran a brisk and legitimate trade. The demand was enormous and arrived on a predictable seasonal schedule. Every summer, thousands of trail hands came into Abilene or Dodge City or Caldwell with months of accumulated trail grime and enough pay to spend on comfort. The bathhouse offered a tub of hot water, a small piece of soap, and a towel for a fee of around 5 to 10 cents, depending on the town and the year. The operational reality of running a bathhouse on the frontier, where hauling and heating water required significant labor and fuel, meant that the water in any given tub was not replaced between every customer. It was reused. How many men used the same water before it was changed depended on the establishment and the volume of business, but period accounts describe water that had turned visibly gray or brown by the later customers of the evening, with a film of residue sitting on the surface. This was not a failure of standards. It was the practical reality of the resource constraints involved. You paid your 5 cents, you got into the tub, you came out cleaner than you went in, roughly speaking, and you appreciated it anyway. The saloons contributed their own chapter to the public health record of the frontier. The communal towel, a single cloth hanging near the bar for any patron to wipe his face or beard, is documented in first-hand accounts from the period. In a busy saloon during the nights after a drive arrived, that towel passed through a very large number of hands and faces over the course of an evening. Skin conditions, respiratory infections, and communicable diseases of various kinds moved from person to person on it with complete efficiency. No one thought of it as unusual. It was the standard arrangement, encia, the same way the communal water dipper was the standard arrangement at the town well. Venereal disease spread rapidly and extensively through the cattle town population every season when the drives came in. The combination of long isolation, sudden income, and the commercial establishments that catered to both created conditions well suited to transmission. Syphilis and gonorrhea both appear consistently in the medical records and newspaper accounts of the frontier towns throughout the cattle drive era. The treatment available reflected where medicine stood in the 1800s. There were no antibiotics. The standard treatment for syphilis was mercury, administered internally in various forms over extended periods. The phrase that circulated among both doctors and patients was that one night with Venus led to a lifetime with mercury. The mercury was genuinely effective at slowing the progression of the disease in the early stages, but prolonged exposure to it caused serious damage of its own, including neurological deterioration, tooth loss, and compounding systemic harm. Some men who lived into their 50s and 60s with symptoms their contemporaries attributed to age and hard living had likely been carrying the effects of long-term mercury treatment for years without knowing it. It is worth pausing on all of this and recognizing what these men absorbed as a simple condition of their profession. The physical discomfort, the disease risk, the gradual deterioration, none of it was extraordinary or exceptional by the standards of their time. It was just the baseline of what working life on the trail cost. They endured it because the work paid better than most alternatives, because they knew no other life, and because the alternatives, factory work in the eastern cities or breaking sod on a homestead claim, carried their own considerable miseries and dangers. The American cowboy became one of the defining cultural figures of the 19th century and has stayed that way ever since. The mythology built around him is largely the creation of dime novels, Wild West shows, and eventually film, which perfected the image of the clean-jawed man on a tall horse riding toward a sunset that conveniently did not smell like anything. The reality was something far less cinematic and considerably more interesting. The actual working cowboy was tougher than the legend, though more practically resourceful than the image, and dealing every day with conditions that most people in the modern world cannot easily picture. So the next time a Western comes on screen and the hero rides into town looking composed and sun-bronzed after months on the trail, think about what was actually living in the seams of those clothes. Think about the gray bathwater and the communal saloon towel and the pliers by the blacksmith's workbench. Think about whether you could have done the job. Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. Thank you for watching. My name is Clay. This is your channel for the real history of the American West. Subscribe if you have not already, and we will see you in the next one.